Hey everybody, welcome back to our channel and welcome back to the Vinyl Review. This is Billy with Wolf River Music, and here we are at episode number 3. And just like we said last time, here is the album The Beach Boys Today, which was released on the 8th of March 1965. And by this point in time, the Beach Boys are no longer a brand new band. In fact, this represents their 8th full-length album release in less than 29 total months as a professional recording group. They've been around now since about the summer of 1961, when they were first known as the Pendletones, and then later, in early 1962, changing their name to the Beach Boys. It was actually at the behest of brother Dennis Wilson, who was the only avid surfer of the group, and at his urging for them to adopt this Southern California lifestyle image for the group. And so they began writing catchy little pop songs that celebrated what was then considered the youth lifestyle of the West Coast of the United States. In September of 1961, Brian Wilson wrote the song Surfin', and cousin Mike Love wrote Surfin' Safari. The first single ever recorded and released by the group was Surfin', and while it only reached up to number 75 on the national Billboard charts, it was a really big regional hit in Southern California, and this also led to them being signed to a 7-year contract with Capitol Records in June of 1962. Now, I just mentioned a minute ago that the band was originally known as the Pendletones, and then they changed their name to the Beach Boys. Well, in reality, it was actually changed for them. The owner of Candix Records, who had set up the recording session for them and released their very first single, didn't like that name, and he wanted to call them the Surfers. But another group already had that one, and so it was decided that they would be known as the Beach Boys. And without even letting them know beforehand, the new name was printed on the 45 RPM singles and then marketed and sold with that name. The boys didn't really seem to mind that much because they were mostly thrilled that young people around the Los Angeles area were actually responding to and purchasing the new record. As a matter of fact, that single had so many orders placed for it within just the first few weeks that it found Candix Records completely unprepared to handle all of these orders, because it was completely unexpected. This small record label fumbled this process so badly that it actually bankrupted them when they had to return all the money for the unfulfilled orders. The next single they released, which was the Mike Love song Surfin' Safari, was on Capitol Records, and this song was the one that helped catapult them onto the national stage by peaking at number 14 on the national Billboard charts. And this time, it was getting airplay far away from the LA market, even in New York City and up and down the East Coast. Now, we're not going to go through the entire early history of the Beach Boys in this episode, because that would be utterly exhaustive. And our main goal is actually to try to get to this one. But let's just say this. Hit song after hit song and hit album after hit album were released in the years of 1963 and 1964. And the group became an international phenomenon, selling records throughout North America and in the UK. Their popularity was so strong, in fact, that they were really about one of the only big and successful American groups of that era that withstood the surging popularity of the British invasion groups, such as the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, and the Kinks. By 1964, British invasion groups and Beatlemania very quickly took down the popularity and even some of the careers of many of the pre-Motown vocal groups, the American teen idols, the new folk revival artists, and even some of the established R&B acts such as Chubby Checker and Fats Domino. But the Beach Boys remained popular throughout this entire time, although Brian Wilson became extremely aware and eventually also very self-conscious about how his songwriting skills matched up with those of Lennon and McCartney. So much so that we're going to dive deep into that topic, not only here in this particular episode, but also in future episodes anytime Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys are a topic. The careers of both the Beatles and the Beach Boys are a topic worthy of lengthy discussion, because it was this factor of creative competition that would eventually drive Brian Wilson to desire something so much deeper than this commercial pop music of the early Beach Boys albums, and into a much different direction, such as his songwriting and arranging on the Pet Sounds album. But that's a topic that will come up again much later when we get to that point in time in our countdown. Okay, now, as we move closer to this current time period that we're in with the release of this 1965 album, The Beach Boys Today, there is one other small piece of peculiar trivia that I want to bring up, and that is related to the sound of the early Beach Boys music and how it was being compared to the genre of actual surf music in the early 1960s. And here's the truth. The Beach Boys music, especially in those early formative years, was really not surf music at all. At least not in the way that it was defined by the actual and very committed fan base of that specific genre of music. While the Beach Boys may have been writing lyrics such as those found in the songs Surfer Girl, Surfing USA, Surf Jam, and Catch a Wave, surf music of the early 60s was actually predominantly instrumental music, and it was dominated by a very distinctive guitar tone, drenched in tremolo-heavy spring reverb with a very rapid picking style and medium to fast tempos, made popular by the likes of Dick Dale and the Deltones, the Ventures, the Surfaris, and Dwayne Eddy. It had its biggest heyday between about 1962 and 1964. And then, like so many of the other popular genres at that time, it was mostly completely eclipsed by the popularity of the British invasion groups that started taking over American radio stations by the middle of 1964. Okay, now, how this is related to the actual Beach Boys themselves is that as they were just getting started and being marketed to audiences in Southern California as surf music, this was often very confusing to the fans of the music of Dick Dale and the Ventures, etc. The Beach Boys were a vocal pop group that just so happened to put a lot of imagery into the lyrics of their songs that dealt with the Southern California coastal lifestyle. In some cases, this even angered and agitated the fans of instrumental surf music to the point that some of them were known to actually attend early Beach Boys concerts just to jeer at them, to shout at the band on stage in between songs, and even throw fruit and vegetables at them. But let's fast forward very quickly now to about the midway point of the year 1964, and let's focus specifically on Brian Wilson's state of mind in the months leading up to the recording and the eventual release of this album. Because like it was mentioned in earlier episodes, we're always going to put these albums into the historical context and into the environment in which they were written and recorded, because we know that these factors are always going to have the greatest impact, either positive or negative, or a combination of both, on the final outcome of the album in question. And so much was going on here at that time with Brian Wilson that we're going to have to condense the information, or else we're going to end up with a video that's about 4 hours long. First off, we have to bring up briefly the fact that in the first couple of years, The group was being managed by the iron-fisted father of Brian, Carl, and Dennis, who was Murry Wilson. He was a belligerent control freak, and as a semi-talented musician himself, who believed that he had way more talent than he actually did in reality, he butted heads with Brian constantly about not only the musical direction of the group, but also in many other details such as how they should dress, how they should conduct themselves in public, and even down to the minute details about their business dealings and contractual obligations. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on him, and he'll probably come up again in another episode anyway. But let's just say this. He finally pushed Brian to a psychological breaking point in early 1964. And then, with the support of the rest of the band and Capitol Records, the Beach Boys fired Murry Wilson from the role of manager and de facto producer of the band. According to interviews with various band members in later years, they claimed that Murry would accompany the group on tours and would make attempts to keep them all from drinking any alcoholic beverages, to keep them from ever uttering even a mild profanity at any time for any reason, and to never, under any circumstances at all, fraternize with female fans. And he was essentially making it a point of fining each member of the band up to $1,000 each per incident by taking funds out of the touring revenue and then keeping it for himself. Now you can only imagine the tension that this overbearing type of behavior exhibited by Murry Wilson was causing within the ranks of a band made up of young men in their early 20s, who by that time had already become international music superstars. They just weren't having it any longer. And so, in April of 1964, Brian Wilson and cousin Mike Love were appointed with the task of confronting Murry in his own home and telling him that they had voted unanimously as a band to fire him from his self-appointed duties as band manager. And this, of course, did not go over very well at all. So badly, in fact, that later, at a recording session, ironically for the song Fun, 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 Brian got into a physical altercation with his own father after Murry decided to disrupt the recording session by showing up uninvited and starting a shouting match. This wasn't the only time that an interaction similar to this one would happen. In fact, it happened again during one of the recording sessions for this album, and more specifically, during the actual recording of the song Help Me Rhonda. So this was in January of 1965. Brian had invited his father to come into the studio, just to be nice to him, I guess. And then Murry just kind of started acting like an ass by constantly interrupting the recording process and then offering a lot of unsolicited advice that really just came across as Murry trying to defend his own self-importance to the band and his own skills as a so-called music producer. Well, Brian eventually asked him to leave so that they could just simply finish the recording session. And the reason that I know all of this is because this 10.5 minutes of conversation is actually caught on tape. The tape in the studio was still rolling as Murry was being escorted out the back door. In fact, you know what? This is kind of a crude recording, but here are just a few little snippets of that conversation. So go ahead and judge for yourself what kind of a presence you think Murry Wilson had during these recording sessions. Here it is.
Brian, forget who you are, will you? Let's go. Let's roll. No one can hear what I'm saying because it's too far away from the mic. Brian, the mic is flying those high notes.
Yeah.
We need help.
Who needs help?
We need the honest projection that we used to have.
You want to have like
when you
a
guys get too
497,
much,
right?
when you guys get too much money, you start thinking you're going to make everything a hit.
Well,
Now,
let me ask
Brian,
you this.
Come on now.
I don't want to stop. I just want to make sure this is on tape.
This is an absolute insult.
Well, you're doing the same to me
You're
in
an
front of
ingrate
20
when you do
people.
this. Okay,
Now, let me see.
forget
What
it.
else have we got?
Let's go, dear. I'm sorry. I'll never help you guys mix another stick.
Why?
Because you don't appreciate the good help Chuck Britz and I have given you. You
Don't
took a
appreciate the
beautiful
help.
gift, and then you guys start coming off.
Okay.
Now listen, let me tell you something.
Yes.
When you guys get so big that you can't sing from your hearts, you're going downhill.
Downhill.
Downhill. I've protected you for 22 years, but I can't go on if you're not going to listen to an intelligent man. You think you got it made?
No, we don't.
Son,
We would like to record under
I
an
love
atmosphere
you.
of calmness,
I
and you're
love
not
you. Your
presenting that.
mother loves you.
We like to relax in the
First of
session.
all, you should never have all these people here.
Second of all, who's
Second
but
of all,
they're not saying anything.
You
You're the one that's
forget to sing
talking.
from your hearts. Carl, Dennis is flatting, Mike was flatting on his high notes, Al was tight. I try to give you tips, and you think because you've had a few hits, you got it made.
Why don't
You have to sing from your
Go
heart.
tell Johnny Rivers that. Not
I don't care who you tell, Dick Dale, Capitol Records, anybody. You sing from your heart. Forget it.
All of this, by the way, was causing an incredible amount of stress and mental anguish for the young and already very mentally troubled Brian Wilson. His emotional state of mind was already frazzled for about a dozen other reasons, including his relationship with the young girl who eventually would become his first wife, Marilyn Rovell. When Brian met his future wife at a very early Beach Boys concert in 1962, he was 20 years old. She, on the other hand, was only 14. Marilyn was also a very talented vocalist herself and had been a member of her family singing group, the Rovell Sisters, since she was about 10 years old. Now, she claims that she met Brian by handing him a cup of hot chocolate at that concert, which he then promptly spilled all over her clothing. Now, Marilyn is going to come up again when we get to the Beach Boys album Pet Sounds, because 90% of the subject matter that Brian was writing about at that time involved his very difficult relationship with his then teenage wife. 1964 was a very difficult year for Brian Wilson for many different reasons. And then there was the infamous Phil Spector incident in the summer of '64. Now, Brian was a huge fan of Phil Spector and his famous wall of sound production techniques, and he offered Spector a song called Don't Hurt My Little Sister, which was to be recorded by singer Darlene Love. Well, the way this played out was that Spector initially agreed to do the song, and then he even agreed to hire Brian to play the piano part during the session. So Brian showed up and played a few takes, and Spector basically then just abruptly fired him and told him that his piano playing wasn't up to par and not up to his standards. And then all of a sudden, then he was no longer interested in even recording the song at all. So they cut Brian a check for services rendered and then basically just showed him the door. Now, anyone who knew Phil Spector at all back during those days would tell you that he enjoyed being cruel. He had an incredibly oversized ego, and he thought doing things like that was actually funny. So he probably did it on purpose because he had been told by many people that Brian greatly admired him. So Phil Spector took that as an opportunity to basically humiliate Brian Wilson, probably as a way to show him who he thought was the real boss in the Hollywood music scene. On top of all of this, after the Beatles had appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th of that year, which, like already previously stated in an earlier episode, a full 40% of the entire population of the United States witnessed on live television, Brian immediately began viewing the Beatles as both a threat to his own livelihood and also as a group that he both admired and desperately wanted to emulate in his own career. He spent the better part of the entire next decade both loving the Beatles' music, but also feeling a sense of immense jealousy of their musical abilities and their commercial and creative successes. On December 23rd, 1964, on a plane flight from Los Angeles to a concert date in Houston, Texas, Brian Wilson finally lost it and had a full-blown mental meltdown while the plane was in mid-flight. This date in Houston was meant to kick off a 2-week tour for the band, and Brian actually did manage to play and sing that night on stage, but at the end of this show, he announced to the rest of the band that he would be unable to finish this short tour with them, and that he was going back home, and also that he had no further interest in ever playing live on stage with the Beach Boys ever again. So, Brian went back to Los Angeles, and the remainder of that tour went on with Glenn Campbell filling in for Brian on bass and vocals. And so, here's where Brian Wilson was in the early months of 1965. As the Beach Boys returned from this tour and then prepared themselves for what was yet another month of recording sessions for the album that I am now currently holding in my hand. Now, there is something else that I really want to point out here about this album that anyone who is already a big fan of the Beach Boys will no doubt already know. If you take a close look at the song titles included here, you will surely notice that there is not a single song here that includes the word surf or surfing or any other connotation to anything related to hanging out at the beach or surfing or hot rod cars. By April of 1964, Brian Wilson had boldly proclaimed that he had had enough of the surf music image and would never write another song dealing with the subject matter that was often found on their earlier albums. He was done with all of that. And surprisingly, he also had the support of the rest of his bandmates, who also agreed that the earlier surf music image was growing old and stale, and that because of the rapidly changing times in music, especially due to the emergence of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, that it was more than time for a big change in their music and in their image. But, as you can also imagine, he did not necessarily have the full support of Capitol Records in his newfound desire for a musical change. They wanted the Beach Boys to continue making top 10 hit songs. And if that meant more music about surfing, hot rods, and hot chicks at the beach, well then, they were all for that, continuing as long as it meant more hit songs, sold-out concert tours, and revenue. This little issue is something that will surely come up again. And when we make it to the very next release by the Beach Boys, you can rest assured that this topic is going to have a very large effect on the outcome of that next album. But it's this release that many critics have pointed to as being more of the gateway album, so to speak, to the more critically acclaimed masterpiece that would be released just 14 months after this one. There is so much going on here on this record that is showing rapid advancement of Brian Wilson's musical skills as both a writer and as an arranger. He's taking greater risks with more advanced chord progressions, and he's writing more advanced counterpoint melodies within the vocal arrangements. The lyrical subject matter, at least on side 2, is so much better here than on the surf music albums from just 18 months ago. None of this is Pet Sounds level just yet, but you can surely hear it moving in that direction. Many music critics who have covered this album before have rightly noted that there is a striking resemblance to the material on the Pet Sounds album, which of course would not appear until May of 1966. So it's the song Please Let Me Wonder that is the standout track on this one. There are beautiful major seventh chords in the vocal harmony parts, and a fabulous bass line played by the legendary Carol Kay. This song is showing some serious maturity in the use of a lot of different and various instrumentation, such as a timpani, a vibraphone, grand piano, and a Hammond B3 organ. Another highlight, even though it's on the more pop-oriented side one, is the song When I Grow Up to Be a Man. Brian Wilson later said of this song that he wrote it in basically utter defiance of his father Murry, who would constantly deride him as a weak and an immature youngster, who, at least according to Murray, probably had a dismal future ahead of him. Brian grew up believing these things his father constantly said to him, and then, as time went by, he just eventually stopped believing that any of it was true. So again, we're seeing Brian beginning to start coming out of his shell here, and he's starting to confront some of these issues that have been plaguing him for basically throughout his entire young life. Now he's becoming a man, and well, now he's starting to write songs about it. Musically speaking, this song has some very interesting key changes and also makes use of some mildly dissonant sounding harmonies that are much more advanced than the ones that we've been used to hearing in the past from them. The use of dissonance, even mildly, was just not something that was totally acceptable in the early days of the Beach Boys' music. It's been said that Brian Wilson was so obsessed with getting this song to sound exactly how he wanted it to, that they ended up spending 2 entire full days in the studio on it and recorded a total of 37 different takes of the song until he was happy with it. The main sticking point was that he was riding Brother Dennis really hard to play a drum part that was not a typical backbeat found in a rock or a pop song. And in the end, it sounds like Dennis actually did a really good job with this one. It took 37 different tries to get this right. But hey, if that's what it took, well, then that's what it took. And just FYI, big hit for them. This song hit number 1 in Canada and number 7 in the United States. So, good for them. All right, so now let's just be fair and honest and talk about some of the low points. Other than this album still having some music on it that Brian Wilson was becoming frustrated with because he was wanting so badly to advance faster as a songwriter than his label was ever going to be comfortable with, there's really not a whole lot on here that we would go so far as to call big-time low points. There is, however, some non-musical material contained within this album that is an incredible low point, and unfortunately also serves to kind of wreck the album's rating as a whole. But for now, let's just stick with the musical portion of the album. There are 2 songs on this album that contain the word dance in the title. There's track 1 on side 1 titled Do You Want to Dance? And then there's another one at the very end of side 1 titled Dance, Dance, Dance. Out of all the musical tracks on this album, of which there are 11, these 2 are the weakest. Do You Want to Dance is a cover of the 1958 song by Bobby Freeman. It was a top 10 hit back in 1958 and seems terribly out of place on this current album. Now, why it was included, I don't completely fully know. But I can make a really good guess since it was chosen as one of the 3 singles to be released from this record. It was not there for artistic purposes, so to speak, but there because it had already been a hit for someone else several years previous. The lyrics on this one are really just typical schlocky 50s doo-wop teen stuff. For example, come on baby, give me your hand. Oh baby, do you want to dance? Well, do you want to dance under the moonlight? Squeeze and hug me all through the night. Oh baby, do you want to dance? And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much about it for lyrics. So there's nothing harmful or terribly revolting about any of that. But, I mean, it's just kind of like, okay, whatever. Now, musically speaking, this one is actually a bit more impressive, and it features LA session musicians from the very famous Wrecking Crew, such as Hal Blaine on the drum kit and Leon Russell on the Hammond B3 organ. There is excellent vocal work here, as per usual from these guys, and Brian Wilson's orchestral arrangements on this song are really just as strong here as they are everywhere else. So again, it's really hard to call this song a low point. It's just that in comparison with the rest of Brian's material on this album and the direction that he seemed to be desperately signaling that he wanted to go in, this just kind of seems like fluff, and only there just to be one of the radio-friendly singles. Now, as for the other song also mentioned, Dance, 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 this one is actually an original, and it was also released as a single several months before the rest of this album was even recorded. And on this one, really, about the only problem that we have with it is that it just sounds like the Beach Boys doing a cover of themselves. In other words, this one also feels out of place here, because it sounds like the band is channeling themselves from 1963 and not really from 1965. We're still hesitant to call the song truly a low point because there's nothing inherently wrong with it. There's just not any real lyrical depth to it. But it was sung and it was played very well. Again, we have Wrecking Crew musicians present. Hal Blaine, again, doing some of the percussion work here, and this one also features the one and only Glenn Campbell on rhythm guitar. It's catchy, and it was destined to be one of their many hit songs. But so what? I mean, we don't really care about hit songs here, right? Look, these two tracks don't tank the album in any way. It's just that they don't really elevate it either. Okay, so now here is the one that tanks the overall rating of this album as a whole. And this one is going to be controversial because while some of you might agree, there may be others that might just be like, I don't really see what the big deal is, and maybe some of you that just want us to just chill out and get over it. Okay, but here it is. Who is it who made the decision to put that stupid recording of the band sitting in a room talking about cheeseburgers and French fries for just like absolutely no good reason at all? Why is that nonsense included on this album and taking up what is technically speaking about 7% of the entire vinyl real estate of what is already a very short collection of songs? If you don't already know what I'm talking about here, there is a track at the very end of the album called Bull Session with Big Daddy. And it was originally about 20 minutes of banter between the band and a guy named Earl Leaf, who was a photographer and a columnist, mostly known for writing articles in teeny bopper magazines. Nothing said here is of any real value at all in this, and it's really just a bunch of worthless noise that no one is ever going to want to go back to and listen to twice. Now, I'm sure that in the prologue episode of this series, that it was mentioned that we use a list of 45 different questions in order to evaluate and then to give a rating to each and every one of the albums that we review. One of those questions deals with a little issue of something that we like to call repeatability or a desire to come back. That would be a 0 for this one. Now, one of the other criteria that we judge very harshly is the idea of anyone putting filler material onto an album purposefully just to create more running time. Now, the question was asked just about a minute ago about whose idea was it to put this non-musical track onto this album. And actually, there is an answer for that. That would be vocalist Mike Love. Or, to be more fair, let's just say that he was at least part of that decision. And many years later, he still doesn't see a problem with it. I can assure you that we are not the only ones who have ever brought this up, and we're hardly the first to ever question this decision. Here is a direct quote from Mike in an interview from just 2 months ago. And I'll just read it to you directly what he said about it. Quote, "Bull Session with Big Daddy is pretty silly. It's just a bunch of young guys experiencing a lot of success, and we're just relieving stress, not concentrating on releasing another hit. It occurred to us that if we were to record this, it will be enough to complete an album, and then we can turn in the album to the label. It was just a way to lighten the mood." Unquote. Okay, Mike, lightening the mood is one thing, but in our opinion, no one needed to hear this recording, and it just seemed unprofessional to mar the ending of a perfectly decent album by including this. So are we just being a little bit too harsh by talking about this so much? You might be saying to yourself, "Oh, come on, Billy, what's the big deal? Just get over it, right?" Okay, fine. Fair enough. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on then to the final rating that we gave this album. And then I'm going to give you a little more food for thought regarding this same topic and how we're going to try to be as fair as we possibly can if and when this same situation ever comes up again on the vinyl review, which it surely will. So here's the final grade we gave the album The Beach Boys today, as it is fully represented right here. We gave it a 7.4, which again, on our grading scale, is a C. Okay, I can hear you now. Billy, how can you do that? How can you be so harsh on a classic album like this one? Well, actually, it's very simple. Side 1 is full of pop songs that were put there mostly as a way to please Capitol Records. Side 2, other than the filler track at the end that was put there on purpose, was Brian's side of the album, which more closely resembles the kind of music that he actually wanted to write and record at this point in his life and career. Let's do something different, because we have a very unique situation that's going on here with this album. Let's break this down just a little bit more. Okay, let's go ahead and give the band a mulligan and take out the big mistake that's at the end here. You know, everybody does something dumb every now and then. And then let's see what the album gets after we take out the 2 minutes of rubbish that they put in there. Now, the album gets a 7.8, which is a C+. And you still may be flabbergasted by this low grade. Surely it's better than that, isn't it? Well, let's break this down even one step further. Now, do you remember how I told you that side 1 was the side that Capitol Records wanted, and side 2, or at least the 5 musical tracks, belonged to Brian and what he wanted to do? Well, Capitol Records for side 1 got a 7.6, and Brian on side 2 got an 8.2, which is a B-. And so there you have it. If the powers that be had just left him alone and not pressured him for pop songs and dance hits, this album would have surely rated out so much better than it ultimately did. Now, I really want to drive the point home here that we are grading entire albums and not just selected songs. And so the official grade that the Beach Boys today still has is a 7.4, because that is the album that I am currently holding in my hand right now. At the end of our 3rd installment of this video series, which, as you most likely can already tell, is not designed as just simply an album review series, but really more as a history and a review of the albums that we're choosing to cover, and in chronological order. And I hope that by now, assuming that you've seen the other 2 videos, that there is a pattern emerging here. 3 C's in a row given to some of the biggest and most acclaimed acts in rock history: the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and now the Beach Boys. So what's the pattern here? 3 very young bands that are being worked ridiculously hard and being forced to record no less than 3 albums a year and tour for their respective record labels. And these record labels obviously don't know the staying power that these 3 bands would have. And so they're trying to milk every single thing that they possibly can out of them in the shortest amount of time. The music business is a business after all. And it's very important that you always remember that. Never forget it. These 3 bands are going to come back very often in this review series. And you're about to see a rapid transformation on who ended up calling the shots once these groups finally proved themselves. These C's are eventually going to turn into A's, and you're going to see them starting to make some of the greatest albums ever created in the history of modern music and in the 20th century. Please come back and visit us again next time, right here on the Vinyl Review. In our very next episode, we're going to go a little bit more on the obscure side, and we're going to take a closer look at a group that was popular for a short time, but certainly not on the scale of the 3 that we've covered so far. We're headed back to the UK, back again to Liverpool, and we're going to take a closer look at a group that called themselves the Searchers. And as always, thank you so much for being here with us. This is Billy with Wolf River Music, and you've been watching the Vinyl Review. Take care. Have a great night.